It's a great honor to have been invited to speak to you all here this evening at the Church Monuments Society. Fittingly enough, I'm coming to you from Kilkenny in southeast Ireland, where this year we're celebrating the 700th anniversary of the witch trials of Dame Alice Kittler. It's a spooky enough looking evening here in Kilkenny. We've mist rolling in from the hills here. So it's very, very fitting. It's also very fitting, I suppose, that I'm coming to you from what is essentially Ireland's church monuments capital, the medieval city of Kilkenny, which, thanks to our very rich stone cutting tradition, the abundant Kilkenny black fossiliferous limestone, often called Kilkenny marble. The city is home to around 400 medieval and early modern church monuments, and that represents about a quarter of the entire corpus on the island of Ireland. So there are some wonderful funerary monuments to be found today at the Cathedral of St. Canice here, that you can see, best known of which are the very elaborate altar tombs with effigies supported on decorated side panels for the nobility and the squirearchy of later medieval Kilkenny. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with this famous effigy of Piers Butler, who's the 8th Earl of Ormond. And this is one of a series of major Butler of Ormond tombs that effectively transformed the medieval cathedral into a dynastic necropolis during the course of the 16th century. But the site I will be concentrating on this evening is the former parish church of the Blessed Virgin Mary, St. Mary's, which is, you can see here, a photo taken the other day. The site of St. Mary's, it's located within the walls of the medieval town of Kilkenny, beside the main marketplace of the medieval high town. The church was built in the shadow of the great castle that was built by William Marshal, who's the Earl of Pembroke and the Lord of Leinster. The exact foundation date of St. Mary's is unknown, but it seems to be somewhere between probably 1200 and 1205. And William Marshal built St. Mary's on a grand scale to serve his capital town. The church was much diminished in the mid-1700s, shortly before this map of Kilkenny was drawn in 1758 by John Roke. It was much diminished by the demolition of its chancel and its side, its nave side aisles. So here's the church represented on John Roke's map of 1758. And you can see the nave, what's left of the chancel and the transepts. And here we have a 14th century tower that was originally attached to the nave. The site now is the Medieval Mile Museum, which displays, amongst other exhibits, the corpus of about 110 funerary monuments from the church. And we find here there's effigies of the Anglo-Norman colonists and their descendants who established the medieval town. For example, we've Helen, the effigy of Helen of Armeel here, with its inscription seeking soul prayers in Norman French on the left, and then on the right is the mid-14th century double effigy of William and Margaret Gore, appropriate surname, an appropriate surname for this Halloween night. We can also find here at St. Mary's the elaborate altar and Renaissance style wall tombs of the Old English Catholic merchant oligarchy, who, despite the wars of religion and reconquest that occurred between the Reformation and the Cromwellian assault on Kilkenny of 1650, they continued to memorialise the dead at St. Mary's. These monuments have been the subject of really outstanding research by Dr. Amy Harris and Dr. Paul Cockram of this parish. And the tombs were the work of local tomb builders such as the Kerrans and the O'Tonys, and they fused traditional Catholic monuments with influences coming from the Protestant Reformation and the English Renaissance worlds. So, for example, we have the splendid in situ altar tomb here, commemorating Elena Walsh and Walter Lawless, who died in 1573. And you can see it absolutely abounds with Catholic imagery on the front panel of the tomb here. But if we look at one of the side panels, we can see there's a classic Reformation motif here of the family in prayer. Similarly, the Renaissance style wall tomb of John Roth Fitzpiers, who dies in 1619. Again, this is a product of the Kerran School of Monumental Sculptures. It has a very traditional Catholic altar tomb as its lowest tier, but very non-traditional humanistic Renaissance elements too. There's the urns, heraldry, and then there's a poem up here on the transience of life. And these are included on its very classical canopy and entablature. So what we have here at St. Mary's is the very interesting example of the post-Reformation survival of Catholic tombs. And these contribute quite a bit to research particularly on the reach and impact of the Reformation on the traditional religion. But what has been missing, I would suggest, is archaeological approaches to the tombs. It's not been possible in any kind of substantive way at any of Ireland's parish churches, and my own large-scale excavations at St. Mary's here between 2015 and 2017, which is the main focus of my talk this evening, when the church has been repurposed for a museum. And they really represent the first time we've had a good chance to archaeologically investigate the setting of the tombs on this site or any other site in Ireland. We know that the Church of St. Mary's had chantry chapels during the Middle Ages and into the 17th century. They're recorded in the wills of the merchant oligarchy and other contemporary records. And so the prospect of exploring these chantry chapels was very, very exciting, I have to say. Just before I get into what we discovered in our excavations, just to explain a little on the chantry movement and what drove it. So the chantry movement was one of the key institutions of the traditional religion between the 13th century and the Reformation in Britain, and beyond this, beyond the Reformation in parts of Ireland. Chantries were generally additions to church spaces. They're self-contained chapels. They're often divided off from the rest of the church by either a stone or a wooden screen, a thing called a park close screen. And for example, here you can see the 15th century chantry that was endowed by Bishop Fox at Winchester Cathedral. Here's an image of the now lost Chantry screen for the Earls of Kildare, which was originally set up at Dublin's Christ Church Cathedral. So these chapels, they housed the two monuments to the dead and an altar, along with a range of commemorative objects and all the fixtures and fittings that would have been required by the Chantry priests, who were specifically endowed by the benefactor to sing, to chant, and thus the name of the chapels, masses for the souls of their benefactors. And as well as providing for the chapel and its contents, the patron also had to endow the housing of the Chantry chaplains, if it's a secular foundation, or if it's a monastic foundation, one or more of the religious to serve the needs of the Chantry. And to enable these endowments, land and properties were often attached to the chantries, and the proceeds of these then would have provided the resources that the chaplains needed. Where did this all come from? Well, chantry chapels were a response to the medieval obsession with death. And it's not, the obsession is not so much with death as such, but the act, with the act of dying, but it's the fear of what would follow was really at the forefront of people's minds. And we can see this very clearly in the 1619 will of John Roth Fitzpiers, who's the one-time mayor of Kilkenny and the old English Catholic merchant builder of this famous house here, the Roth's Merchants House on Parliament Street in the middle of Kilkenny. And his will begins with the following words: I, John Roth Fitzpiers of the city of Kilkenny, alderman, being in perfect health and memory, considering the frailty of man's life, and yet nothing is more certain than death, nor more certain than the hour thereof, do make this my last will and testament. And in his will, Roth makes provision for his burial monument, which we've already seen, and he also makes provision for a chaplain to pray for his soul in his Chantry chapel that's dedicated to the Holy Trinity at St. Mary's. And this was one of the chapels that was archaeologically investigated, and about which more anon. So John Roth's deep uncertainty with the question of what would happen to him in the afterlife very much reflects the widespread obsession with death and the beyond that tormented the minds of men, women, and children at this time. The medieval Christian faithful believed that for those who could escape hell after death, their souls had to be purified of the accumulated sins of a lifetime in purgatory before they could achieve grace and enter heaven. So purgatory, as contemporary illustrations like this 13th century doom painting from Chalden Church in Surrey depict, was believed to be a very real and a very terrifying place. Contemporary texts such as the 12th century legend of the Purgatory of St. Patrick on Lough Derg in Ireland describe in disturbingly vivid detail what awaited in purgatory. It's an infernal pit, a vast gulf, dark and emitting an intolerable stench, and full of screaming and howling. And by the pit was a serpent of infinite magnitude, bound by a great chain. Before the mouth of the serpent stood a multitude of souls, which he sucked in like flies as each breath, and then, with the return of respiration, blew them out, scorched to sparks. And this process continued till the souls were purged of their sins. So reading the likes of that, it's little wonder then that people were completely fixated on doing everything they possibly could to lessen the amount of time they had to spend having their souls punished in such inhospitable places. And there were certain strategies that could be employed in life and on your behalf by those that you left behind to diminish the time that was spent in purgatory and to improve your chances of attaining salvation. The mid-15th century manuscript, The Desert of Religion, you can see a page from it here, depicts some of these strategies. There's the power of the Mass and charitable deeds as a means of breaking free of the burning pit of purgatory and ascending cleansed of sin. In this case, via a bucket on a rope. You'd have to say, could they not have offered something a little bit more luxurious than a bucket after all they've been through before they get into the kingdom of heaven? For the vast bulk of the faithful, it was meek suffering and good works that provided the most practical means of achieving indulgences that reduced the amount of time being spent in purgatory. Meek suffering includes a vast range of acts of penance, devotion, fasting, pilgrimage, and all sorts of personal suffering. Good works encompasses a broad range of elements also, but of all the good works that could be undertaken to mitigate purgatorial anguish, direct investment in the church, principally to facilitate the Mass and prayers for the dead, was considered to have the greatest effect, and unsurprisingly was much encouraged by the church authorities. So this resulted in an absolutely extraordinary level of lay investment into the church in the form of endowments for works to the church fabric, all sorts of fittings, windows, tiling of floors, altar plate being poured into the churches, and generally these good works would bear inscriptions or some reminders requesting soul prayers for the patron, all to ensure that the soul was remembered and to attract indulgenced prayers. But the good work that had the most monumental and profound impact on the material and mental terrain of the medieval church was the Chantry chapel. Now, in Ireland, ideas about this liminal world between the dead and the living had been around going right back to early Christian times, but there was a massive advancement of the movement in Ireland from about the late 13th, early 14th century onwards. This is probably due to the formalization of the doctrine of purgatory in a 1274 papal decree. So this resulted in many existing churches being augmented, some being rebuilt entirely to accommodate chantries. For example, we have St. Mary's here in Goran in County Kilkenny, which was established in the late 13th century, and it was endowed with literally teams of collegiate clergy or their vicars who were endowed to continuously pump out masses for the souls of the benefactors. And in this case, that was Edmund Butler, his wife Joan, and their son James Butler, who's the first Earl of Ormond. These attracted further chantry foundations, which were appended onto the main body of the church. For example, we have the 16th century Keeley chantry attached to the southwest side of the nave at Gorn. In some of the larger urban parish churches, virtually every available space would have been taken up by chantries of the merchant families and those of the town guilds and the confraternities. In many cases, this absence of space inside the church necessitated the building onto the main church of new chantry chapels. And a good example of this is to be seen today at St. Mary's in New Ross, where the east side of the south transept was added onto by two separate chantry chapels that you can see here. Similarly, at St. Nicholas's in Galway, The impact of the Chantry movement on the fabric and layout of the church is also plain to see. Much of the space at St. Nicholas's would have been given over to these chapels, for which were endowed by the merchant oligarchy, the tribes of Galway, who, as so called, who controlled the town, and the formal elevation of the church then in 1484 to a collegiate foundation would have undoubtedly attracted many new foundations. The various extensions and the exceptionally wide aisles at St. Nicholas's which has resulted in this very unusual triple gabled facade at its western end that you can see here. These were presumably built primarily to provide enough space to facilitate the demand for chantry foundation in this church. And then this is all borne out by the inclusion in the index to the 1660 pictorial map that you can see here of Galway, and that describes 14 altars within the church. For example, we have the Chapel of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the south transept, and St. Anne's Chapel in the north transept, and St. Patrick's Chapel to the north of the choir. Within the chantries, tombs, such as this example here to the harper William O'Houlihan at Jerpoint Abbey in Kilkenny, they were specifically designed to attract prayers for the soul of the deceased by being covered in Catholic religious symbolism. These were reminders of the piety of those commemorated, but they were also there to attract the prayers of the family and also of passerbys, who themselves then were granted indulgences for praying or meditating on the symbols or praying to particular saints. Most of the tombs also doubled as altars, and this enabled the Mass to be said as close as possible to the remains, which was considered to be particularly effective. Now, the ultimate terror was to be forgotten by family and society, with no prayers being said for the soul, which would then become forever trapped in purgatory. And because of this, virtually all the inscriptions that we find on tombs of the period contain reminders and pleas to pray for the soul of the deceased. Some inscriptions even explicitly granted clemencies to those who prayed for the soul of a particular individual. For example, here we have the effigial tomb of James Shortall, who's the Lord of Ballylarkin at St. Canice's Cathedral. He died around 1534, and it includes the inscription in Latin, I'll translate it, an indulgence of 80 days is granted to everyone who says the Lord's Prayer and the Hail Mary for their souls and the souls of their parents. Now, up until the Reformation, the Chantry movement was one of the key institutions of the traditional religion. But their attached theology and their wealth and influence also made them a target for the reformers. And thus, at the Reformation, what was termed the vain and the superstitious devotional tradition of purgatory was outlawed. And this fundamental shift, it violently ruptured that thread that had bound the living to the dead. The living could no longer help the dead, and the dead could no longer rely on the living to intercede on their behalf. And whilst his father, Henry VIII, had taken a somewhat benign approach to the chantries, Edward VI here, or certainly his councillors anyway, took to their demise with relish. And his 1547 Chantry Act was an asteroid strike on the chantries in England, Wales, and Scotland. It led to the destruction of thousands of these chapels, along with their artworks and stonecraft, amongst other things. Now, the situation in Ireland was quite different, because critically, Ireland was excluded from the Chantry Act. So in towns that remained staunchly Old English and Catholic, like Kilkenny, which was the bastion of the Counter-Reformation in Ireland and the capital of a Catholic Confederate government between 1642 and 1650, the chantries continued to be founded and used for burial and ritual well into the 1600s. Today, very few chantry chapels remain intact in Ireland, or at least have been recognised anyway as such. Nearly all appear to have been destroyed or certainly badly disturbed during the late 17th century. Most of them appear to have been demolished during the 18th and early 19th century. For example, with Ross Early here in County Galway, attached to the Franciscan Friary, a very typical example here of what you might see of a chantry chapel in Ireland today. This is it from the outside, the interior. So despite chantry chapels being so central to religious belief systems in Ireland, they haven't enjoyed very much by way of academic study. There's been a certain amount of work done on their surviving documentary records relating to some of the foundations, but there's been very little archaeological research done on them. And certainly nothing like the marvellous work that's been done by scholars like Dr. Simon Roffey, who has, through the use of archaeological approaches to them, expanded our understanding of English chantries far beyond what's available from the written sources. He's done amazing work on their architectural development, their internal arrangements, fixtures and fittings, and the mortuary and ritual practices that took place inside the chapels based on archaeological research. So the opportunity then to archaeologically excavate within the chantries at St. Mary's was a very, very exciting prospect. Myself and my team, we spent the bulk of 2 years excavating at St. Mary's in advance of the museum's construction. Around 70% of the interior area was excavated, so that's all the area in green here, to around a metre or so below modern ground level. This was to accommodate various museum substructures, underfloor heating and that kind of thing. There's also some excavation out in the graveyard as well to accommodate service trenches and that kind of thing. Now, inside the church, the level of preservation of archaeology was quite extraordinary. And this is because the interior of the church had been buried under a metre of clay and rubble that had been obtained when the chancel and the side aisles were pulled down in the 1740s. This was the most extensive excavation ever undertaken in an Irish medieval parish church, and because of the level of preservation, it led to some quite extraordinary discoveries, including new medieval and early modern funerary sculptures, a myriad of burial vaults filled with coffins, human skeletal remains, about 180 in total, ranging in date from the late 12th all the way up to the 19th century. About 4,500 artifacts were discovered, including a very interesting corpus of carved stones representing funerary monuments. And of course, the largely intact chantry chapels of some of the great Kilkenny merchant families, which I'm here to talk to you about this evening. So, historical records, mostly the wills and a 1640 description of the church by Bishop David Roth, record at least 12 individual chantry chapels within St. Mary's between around 1540 and 1640. They're founded mainly by the Old English Catholic merchants, Archer, Roth, Triumvirate, who effectively controlled the town at the time. And there's very little information on chantry foundations before this time. I've no doubt that they were being founded, but we just don't have either the documentary or the archaeological evidence for them thus far. We can, using the documentary evidence that we do have, we can reconstruct the locations within the church of the various chantry chapels based on the historical records. Also, original tomb locations, and then the results of the archaeological excavation. So you can see here, this is a reconstruction of St. Mary's as it would have appeared around 1640 or so. And we have the Roth Chantry in the north transept, the Archer Chantry in the south transept, and various others. So when we lifted the floor and removed the rubble, sorry, slow here. When we lifted the floor and removed the rubble infill, there were 3 exquisitely carved post-Reformation 16th century altar tombs discovered to various members of the Roth family. These were in situ against the north wall of the Roth Chantry of St. Michael the Archangel, which was founded in the mid-1500s and occupied the north transept. It had its own private entrance from the churchyard, which was here. And it's a plan of what we found in the excavations. See, there's the 3 chest tombs that I've mentioned. On the west side of the chapel, just here, there was a stepped limestone altar predella, which was uncovered. And this would have been used by the chantry priest to say mass. And this was found to cover the main family burial vault. This is one of the chest tombs we discovered to John Roth Fitzrobert, who died in 1590, his wife and other members of his family. It's got a typical cover slab of the period with interlaced cross and black letter inscription asking for prayers for the soul of those commemorated. And in the northeast corner of the chapel, another chest tomb was discovered. Again, its cover is missing. The side panel bears very fine decorated style window, very likely the work of the O'Tunney School of Monumental Sculptures. You can see it here. The predella then on the west side of the chantry, very finely made of Kilkenny limestone again. And this supports the 1637 tomb of Richard Roth, which was raised in the 19th century to the then floor level, which is why it's kind of elevated here above the predella. What's interesting about Roth's monument, remember Roth is a Catholic, is his tomb is made for him by Patrick Curran, but it's devoid of any Catholic motifs, and it's style of tomb I think that the reformers would have approved of. The predella itself covered and contained the stepped entrance into the main Roth family burial vault. We went down into it, and within the vault there's a stack of collapsed wooden coffins which continued at least a metre or so below the ground level, and presumably included further Roth burials underneath. These have not yet been investigated. One of these burials is very likely to be Bishop David Roth, who was a leading European figure in the Counter-Reformation and the spiritual leader of the Confederation of Kilkenny, who died at the hands of Oliver Cromwell in 1650. Now, the final coffin in the stack had upholstery nails forming initials and a date, and within the coffin, there's the remains of an elderly woman who's buried in a cross shroud and possibly a bonnet, and she's buried in French silk burial stockings. This is her burial shroud here, and you can just see the silk ribbon in the sign of the cross. And we think this is something akin to how she would have appeared in her coffin here. Her bonnet and sleep attire being representing the long sleep of death. So the initials on the coffin are CR 1714, and this can be identified with Catherine Roth, the Archdeacon, who's said to have held the hand of the dying Bishop Roth on his deathbed in 1650. So what's interesting about this is that it suggests that the Roths continued to use their family burial chapel long into the penal era, when St. Mary's was entirely given over to the Church of Ireland worship. But at this time, the chantries would have morphed into private Catholic family mortuary chapels that were attached to the Church of Ireland church. On the south side of the north transept, and probably still within the Roth Chantry Chapel, and though not in its original position, there was a spectacular discovery of a double effigy of a husband and wife in Kilkenny limestone again. You can see she's dressed in a long gown with tippets, which come into vogue in the 1340s. She's really elegantly captured here in the stone craft. Brian and Moira Gittos have written a splendid report on the effigies, and they characterize it as having originated from the same workshop as a number of other effigies that are found in the Kilkenny area, including one of the most famous of them all, which is the Cantwell Knight here, the Cantwell Fada, as it's called, in Kilfane, County Kilkenny, near Thomastown. The double effigy at St. Mary's covered a very unusual oval stone and plaster lined grave, which contained the burial of a child and also an abundance of charnel. And interestingly, also, we found a number of 17th century Catholic devotional medals had been placed over the effigy. These are medals to Saint Charles Borromeo, who's a key figure in the Catholic Counter-Reformation. The excavation produced around 4,500 artifacts, as I said earlier, but I don't have time to go into them. But of particular interest for the chantries, I think, were the numerous fragments of these absolutely stunning 16th century Portuguese patterned or azuelo wall tiles that were found in the chapel. Chemical ICP analysis of the fabric of some of the tiles that we found was undertaken by Dr. Mike Hughes, and thanks to that we've been able to pin down their precise production site to a kiln that was excavated on Avenue Los Buenos Aires in Lisbon. And we can see these particular wall tiles intact in the church in the castle of Óbidos in Lisbon, which really brings home how spectacular this chantry chapel would have been in its heyday. The floor of the Roth chantry was covered by Normandy floor tiles, and they would have been arranged in a checkerboard green and yellow pattern. And again, we've identified their kiln site through chemical analysis to a kiln site near Rouen in Normandy. Now into the south transept of St. Mary's, and we find the Archer Chantry of St. James. Just here, beneath the paved flues of the Victorian heating system and a massive dump of debris, there was a whole series of new burial vaults discovered and a freestanding stone altar, which is just here, which this is it partially uncovered. There's the Victorian heating system. The altar, freestanding chest tomb altar with a dedication to Walter Archer, who's the first MP for Kilkenny. He died in 1575, and his wife, Joanna Hackett. And their mortal remains were interred in a stone cist grave beneath the altar, just down here. Now, within the Archer Chantry, there's a honeycomb of subterranean vaults. The earliest appear to date to the 16th century. And including here, we found the double burial vault for the Archer family. This was originally topped off by a monument which stood here right up until the 1960s to Thomas Archer, who died in 1617, and his wife, Margaret Cransborough. Within the burial vault, there's a reconstruction of the original tomb of Thomas and Margaret. This is reconstructed based on fragments that still survive today. So within the burial vault, beneath the tomb, very fine oak coffins with iron fittings, and one individual within this coffin here, he was buried in shoes that had been specifically designed for his last burial. These were shoes that were not designed to be worn. They were specifically to accompany him in death. Now, into the She Chapel in the former chancel. This was the She Chantry dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And the She family are one of the wealthiest of the Kilkenny oligarchy, and their chantry was fittingly located in the most prestigious area of the church, behind the high altar in the chancel. So we reckon the high altar was somewhere around here, and they occupied this space behind it. The chancel itself had been largely pulled down around 1739, leaving what remained of the chantry and its tombs exposed. Here's a plan of the chantry, and you can see there's tombs there to the Shees, to Sir Richard She, Elias She, and then there's a series of Victorian intrusive monuments as well. The most illustrious of the She family was Sir Richard She, who died in 1608. And he had, according to a contemporary account, a long and stormy life. So he was taking no chances when it came to purgatory. We know that just before his death, he publicly repented in the marketplace of Kilkenny for his sins. He made confession over and over again. And he established this almshouse here, right next door to St. Mary's on Rose Inn Street, on the proviso that the inmates had to pray for his soul every day. He also left gold coins for the poor of the city, and he endowed a chaplain to say mass for his soul at his magnificent Renaissance-style wall tomb that he'd set up in the She Chantry Chapel in the chancel of St. Mary's. So that's his tomb there. This is a tiered mural tomb and has the 12 apostles as weepers on the altar tomb panels. So classic Catholic at the bottom, but as you go up the levels to the upper tester and the entablature, we find hope, faith, and charity, which could easily pass muster with a contemporary reformer, which raises the question, was he playing both sides just in case? The tomb is also embellished with these absolutely wonderful low relief carvings, which actually nobody knew about until very, very recently when we went through the tomb in detail during a project which I undertook with Dr. Amy Harris to reconstruct the tombs. Unfortunately, had been very badly vandalized about 20 years ago, and a project to reconstruct them. And as we were going through the tombs, we were examining all the surfaces with raking light, and there's these were visible. These are low relief carvings, which presumably were originally painted. We have the acanthus representing the heavenly garden. There's rosettes, winged souls. There's the lion, who is the symbol of courage at the resurrection. And there's grapes, and these are found throughout the upper levels of the tomb. The She burial vault was right beside the tomb, and this is presumably where Sir Richard was buried, along with his two wives, and also some other members of the extended family. There's Thomas She, who's buried in a lead coffin. Here you can just see the remains of his coffin, which again was vandalized back in 2002, I think. He's buried in a lead coffin within the body of the altar tomb. We go down in, this is the entrance to the burial vault. We go down into the vault, and this is what we see. There's the remains of a series of badly broken up timber coffins, a lot of charnel, and these seem to have been pushed into the corner by the interment of this coffin for John Power O'Shea, who died in 1859. And beside the burial vault, a decorated medieval 13th century sarcophagus was partially uncovered. You can just see it here. So the burial vault is just here, and this is part of a very interesting stone sarcophagus, but that was partially uncovered. What was really interesting about this was that the bones, which had originally been within the sarcophagus, had been placed in a pile right beside it, just here. And when we examined the bones, we found that there was all of these black striations, as you can see here, on the body of the quite a number of the bones. This was quite a puzzle to us, and our conclusion after quite a bit of research on this is that they probably represent the remains of medieval embalming of the body, so that the blood vessels, the blood is removed, it's substituted with some mixture of material which has left these black striations on the bones. So our last Chantry chapel that we're going to visit is up here right next to the north transept. This was attached to the northern nave aisle. This is the Holy Trinity Chantry Chapel of John Roth Fitzpiers, who we met earlier. Now, in 1612, he had this chapel built between the outside, between the north transept and the entrance porch. So it's outside the main body of the church itself. And he endowed a chaplain for the foundation. This is the last recorded chantry that we have built at St. Mary's in 1612. And it's about 8 years later then it received his remains. So it's quite remarkable, I would suggest, that here we have a chantry chapel being established 75 years after the Reformation, which had outlawed and dissolved the institutions. In Britain, this would have been simply unthinkable at this time. So there's something very different going on in Ireland at this time. The walls of the chapel had been removed during the mid-18th century demolitions, but the excavations, as you can see in this plan here, uncovered its very, very finely paved floor with 6 stone-lined graves covered by plain ledger slabs. Marked there on the plan. Whether they were perhaps intentionally not inscribed so as to not attract unwanted attention, perhaps, we just don't know, but they're probably graves of members of the Roth family, and they were certainly filled with coffins. We also found the original setting just here for the tomb of John Roth and his wife, Rose Archer. Here's a photo showing the paving and the plain ledger slabs that I was just talking about. And there's the setting for the Roth monument. The tomb had been moved to its current location in the north graveyard wall in about 1820, during which time it's reported that the body of a male accompanied by a pewter chalice was found within the altar section here of the tomb. So one of the stone-lined graves within the Chantry chapel was also investigated in the southeast corner here. And this was found to contain the skeletal remains of 3 elderly males, one on top of the other, and the decayed remains of their timber coffins. Now, what was unusual about this grave was that all the interments had been buried with their heads to the east, which at the time was often the mode of burial that was afforded to ecclesiastics. Radiocarbon dating of the burials indicates there's quite a long span of time between the burial of the first of the males in the 15th century, so before John Roth's chapel was founded, and the final interment in the 17th century, which is presumably contemporary with his chantry. So by providing a much richer understanding of their original setting, their use, and their associated mortuary contexts, I think that it's fair to say the work at St. Mary's demonstrates the value that archaeological approaches can bring to the study of funerary monuments. It's also highlighted the impact that the Chantry movement has had on the form and fabric of the medieval and early modern church in Ireland, both before and after the Reformation. So I'll finish by just saying I hope you can make it over to Kilkenny sometime to visit the Medieval Mile Museum, where you can see the corpus of tombs, also those that were found in the archaeological excavations. There's an exhibition of artifacts from the excavation and much, much more. I'm in the process of preparing for publication a book on the excavation, and in the meantime I've put up some key references for further reading there's some images of the exhibition. Here's some key references for further reading on the last slide. So thank you all very much for listening. Agus Iha Hauna Honadiv Golair. Happy Halloween evening to you all. Thank you.